The cold morning air stung the faces of the 750 men and women as they shuffled through the streets of Toledo. Their heads were bare, their feet bare, and their hearts heavy. The only sound was the muffled weeping and the occasional sob. It was February 1486, and these people were about to face a day they would never forget. The procession began at the church of St. Peter Martyr. The men walked together, their feet raw and aching from the cold stones. They held unlit candles in their hands, a symbol of the light they had lost. The women followed, their heads uncovered, their faces exposed to the harsh glares of the crowd. Both groups were barefoot, a painful reminder of their humiliation. The spectators, many of whom had come from faraway towns, jeered and laughed, adding to the misery. Among the accused were prominent men in high office, now reduced to this shameful walk. They howled and wept, tearing at their hair, more for the dishonor they were suffering than for any wrongdoing they might have committed. The crowd's jeers only made it worse, a constant reminder of their fall from grace. As they approached the cathedral, 2 chaplains stood at the door, each holding a cross. One by one, the accused approached. The chaplains made the sign of the cross on their foreheads, saying, "Receive the sign of the cross, which you denied and lost through being deceived." With these words, the accused entered the church, their spirits broken. Inside, a scaffolding had been erected by the new gate. On it stood the Father Inquisitors, their faces stern and unyielding. Nearby, another scaffolding held an altar where Mass was said and a sermon delivered. The notary then began to call each person by name, asking, "Is the 10th here?" The accused would raise their candle and say, "Yes." In front of everyone, their sins were read aloud, a public display of their supposed crimes. The women were treated no differently. Their sins were read and the shame was shared. When this was over, the inquisitors publicly assigned penance. The accused were ordered to walk in procession for 6 Fridays, barefoot and bareheaded, and to discipline themselves with scourges of hemp cord. They were to fast during these Fridays and were forbidden from holding any public office, such as mayor, bailiff, or judge. They could not be public notaries or messengers, and they were banned from becoming moneychangers, shopkeepers, or grocers. They were not allowed to wear silk, scarlet, or colored cloths, or any jewelry. If they relapsed, they would face the ultimate punishment, death by fire. The morning dragged on, and by 2 o'clock, the sun was high in the sky. The midday meal was a distant thought for the 750 accused, who finally left the church, their lives forever changed. This was just the beginning. The Inquisition would continue to hold these public autos, or acts of faith, for centuries. The ceremonies would become more elaborate, more expensive, and more terrifying. The grandest of these was held in Madrid on 30 June 1680, in the Plaza Mayor. The king and his court attended along with the French ambassador, the Marquis de Villars. The scene was captured by the Italian artist Francesco, Rizzi in a massive painting that now hangs in the Prado Museum. The preparations for this grand auto were extensive. A month before the event, a procession of Inquisition familiars and notaries marched through the streets, announcing the date. The night before, a special procession known as the Green Cross took place, and prayers were offered throughout the night. Early the next morning, Mass was celebrated, and a grand procession led to the square. The scaffolding in the Plaza Mayor was 50 feet long, and raised to the height of the king's balcony. An amphitheater was built for the Council of the Inquisition and other Spanish councils, with the Grand Inquisitor's rostrum placed higher than the king's balcony. Another amphitheater was prepared for the criminals. The day began with a procession led by coal merchants, followed by Dominicans carrying a green cross covered in black crepe. Grandees and other nobles, who were familiars of the Inquisition, joined the procession, which ended at the square. The Dominicans spent the night singing psalms and celebrating Mass. At 8 in the morning, the main procession began. The coal merchants, the king's guards, and figures representing the dead and outlawed were followed by the accused. Some wore yellow sanbenitos with red St. Andrew's crosses, while others wore linen sanbenitos with devils and flames painted on them. These were the relapsed, and they were to be burned alive. The accused passed under the king's balcony, and were placed in the amphitheater. The Grand Inquisitor arrived last, in a purple habit, and the Mass began. After the Mass, the sentences were read. The figures representing the dead were placed in cages, and the accused were also caged, one by one, for all to see. The ceremony lasted until 9 at night, and the king withdrew. The condemned were then handed over to the secular arm and taken to a place outside the city, where they were burned at the stake. One of the most vivid accounts of a burning comes from the auto held at Logrono on 24 August 1719. As the accused stood at the stake, the religious pressed him to convert. With a calm voice he said, "I will convert myself to the faith of Jesus Christ." The religious rejoiced, and the executioner, who had previously called the accused a dog, begged for forgiveness. The accused forgave him, and the two embraced. The executioner then strangled him, and the pyre was set alight. The accused's body fell through the open trapdoor into the flames, and his ashes were scattered, erasing him from the world. The Inquisition's grip on Spain was unyielding, and its ceremonies were designed to strike fear and enforce conformity. The 750 accused in Toledo in 1486 were just the beginning of a long and dark chapter in history. When the Inquisition came to a town, it wanted to scare people. The inquisitors believed that if people were afraid, they would behave better. A Spanish theologian named Francisco Pina once wrote that the main goal of the Inquisition wasn't to save the souls of the accused, but to scare others into following the rules. This idea of using fear as a way to control people is something that many policing systems have used throughout history. However, just because the Inquisition wanted to scare people doesn't mean it always succeeded. In some parts of Spain, especially in Catalonia, people weren't afraid at all. In fact, they often despised the Inquisition. In 1560, the inquisitors in Barcelona complained that the city authorities never showed up to the public ceremonies, called autos de fe. The people of Catalonia, both clergy and laymen, thought the Inquisition was unnecessary and didn't do anything useful. One parish priest even said he didn't care about the Inquisition at all. The Inquisition couldn't do anything to punish him, showing how little power they sometimes had. In some towns, people simply refused to cooperate with the Inquisition. They wouldn't tell on their neighbors, and without this information, the Inquisition couldn't function. This was a significant problem for the inquisitors, because their job relied on information from the public. If people didn't want to help, the Inquisition couldn't do much. Foreign visitors to Spain often had a different view. In 1563, a Venetian ambassador named Toledo said that everyone in Spain was terrified of the Inquisition. He thought the king supported it to control the people, but this was more of a perception rather than reality. The Inquisition had to work hard to maintain its image and power. They were a small group of officials with no guaranteed income or privileges, and they often clashed with other church and state authorities. One of the most important figures in the Inquisition was Fernando de Valdez, who became Inquisitor General in 1547. He played a crucial role in making the Inquisition more powerful and feared. Valdez helped create new rules and procedures for the Inquisition, and made sure it had a steady income. He also wrote alarming letters to King Philip II, claiming that heretics and other enemies were active in Spain. He argued that the Inquisition was the best way to deal with these threats. Despite Valdez's efforts, the Inquisition didn't always have a strong public presence. For over 100 years after it was founded, the Inquisition lacked visual symbols or art that could spread its message. The only symbol they had was their coat of arms, which showed a cross of faith and an olive branch of mercy. This was engraved on the buildings they controlled, but it wasn't enough to make the Inquisition a feared and respected institution. The Inquisition also struggled to gain social acceptance. They didn't have a confraternity, which was a group that could organize public events and give the Inquisition a social identity, until 1603. Even then, it took a long time for the Inquisition to be recognized and respected. For example, a Spanish inquisitor named Pedro Arbuz wasn't beatified by the church until 1662, and he wasn't made a saint until long after the Inquisition was gone. One incident that shows how the Inquisition was sometimes treated with contempt happened in Barcelona in 1561. The inquisitors tried to read an edict during a church service and placed their chairs at the high altar. The bishop and city officials were outraged, and the inquisitors were eventually forced to leave. This incident shows that even in the mid-16th century, the Inquisition wasn't always feared or respected. The Inquisition's lack of visual art and public presence is also interesting. Despite all the public ceremonies and processions, there are very few paintings or other artworks from the time that celebrate the Inquisition. This might be because the Inquisition's activities, which involved punishment and shame, weren't seen as things to be proud of. It could also be because the Inquisition was often at odds with local authorities, who controlled the public spaces where such art might be displayed. Overall, the Inquisition's image and reality were often very different. While it wanted to be seen as a powerful and feared institution, the truth was that its influence varied greatly from place to place and over time. In some regions, like Catalonia, people weren't afraid of it at all, and the Inquisition had to struggle to maintain its position. In the 16th century, when the Spanish Inquisition was at its height, Europeans who wanted to criticize Spain's policies were very active in creating images that portrayed the Inquisition as a terrifying and cruel institution. Many of these images came from artists in Northern Europe, especially from the Netherlands and Germany. During the Dutch Revolt, a period of intense conflict between the Dutch and the Spanish, Dutch artists started making prints that have shaped our view of the Inquisition to this day. These prints were often used as anti-Spanish propaganda and were not always accurate. The first truly detailed and reliable images of the Inquisition appeared in a book called A History of the Inquisition, published by Philip van Limborch in Amsterdam in 1692. Limborch, a Dutch intellectual who believed in religious tolerance, included several engravings that were widely reproduced. Later in the 18th century, a massive 7-volume work called Ceremonies et Coutumes religieuses de tous les pupils du monde by Bernard Picart was published. This work contained many illustrations of the Inquisition, including scenes from the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa, which were often mistakenly attributed to the Spanish Inquisition. Over time, European artists began to create satirical and fictional images of the Inquisition, such as depictions of torture, which became common from the 18th century onward. Interestingly, no authentic Spanish images of the Inquisition were produced during the era of the printing press. In the battle of images, the Inquisition was a clear loser. The Inquisition's power was not as terrifying as it has been portrayed. It relied heavily on the cooperation of the people. Inquisitors used techniques like group therapy, public confession, selective interrogation, and public ceremonies to maintain control. These methods can be seen as a kind of technology of power, a concept explored in a study of the medieval Inquisition in Languedoc, France. However, the social context in Languedoc, where the Inquisitors dealt with closely knit Cathar communities, was very different from Spain, where the Inquisitors often dealt with scattered segments of the general population. This made it harder for the Spanish Inquisition to have the same impact. Inquisitors had to travel long distances through difficult terrain to conduct visitations, which were visits to different towns to gather information and enforce the Inquisition's rules. These trips were often hated by the Inquisitors themselves. They had to carry many documents and deal with hostile local authorities. For example, in 1553, an inquisitor visited 25 towns over 6 months, and in 1554, he visited 22 towns over 4 months. These visits were crucial for the Inquisition's presence, but they were also very demanding and sometimes led to conflicts and a backlog of cases. Despite the Inquisitors' efforts, the Inquisition did not instill widespread fear in the Spanish people. Many rural areas were largely out of touch with the Inquisition. For instance, a correspondent from the Val d'Aran in the Catalan Pyrenees wrote in 1562 that the valley did not even know about the Holy Inquisition. In the Galician countryside, the Inquisition was almost never seen. When inquisitors did visit rural areas, they often found that the communities were resistant to their presence. In 1581, Dr. Caldas, an inquisitor in Barcelona, reported that he was surprised by the lack of denunciations during his 4-month visitation to 23 towns. The denunciations he did receive were often about minor offenses from long ago. This pattern was repeated in other visitations, suggesting that many rural communities solidly rejected the Inquisition's interference. While some areas, like the Diocese of Burgos, saw a higher number of denunciations, which might reflect existing tensions within the population, many other communities, especially those with strong social cohesion, saw the Inquisition as irrelevant. In Morisco areas, where there were more minority groups, people were more willing to denounce themselves under edicts of grace, but they remained silent when edicts of faith were proclaimed. The Inquisition's secrecy, which became a standard practice by the early 16th century, had mixed results. Initially, it helped create a sense of fear, but later it led to hostility and misunderstandings. The Inquisition did not release any information to the public, which left people to imagine the worst. This ignorance fueled the spread of negative legends about the Inquisition, which were evident during debates in the courts of Cadiz in 1813 about whether to abolish the institution. Despite its reputation, the Inquisition had a well-organized administrative system that meticulously recorded its activities. This has left us with a wealth of documentation, making the Spanish Inquisition one of the best-studied early modern institutions. However, like any bureaucratic system, the inquisitors often emphasized their successes and downplayed their failures. The most famous aspect of the Inquisition was the auto de fe, a public ceremony where the sentences of those found guilty were announced and carried out. For Spaniards, the auto de fe began as a religious act of penitence and justice, but later became more like a public spectacle. Foreign visitors, like Jean de Vandenesse and Jean Lermite, often found these ceremonies shocking and distressing, especially the executions that followed. However, public executions were common in other parts of Europe, and were often even more brutal. The contrast between the religious intensity of the auto de fe and the often irreligious behavior of Spaniards in daily life puzzled many foreigners. They wondered if Spaniards were both deeply religious and profoundly irreligious at the same time. This paradox has contributed to the complex and often contradictory image of Spain and the Inquisition that persists to this day. The way we understand the auto de fe, the public punishment ceremony of the Inquisition, has been shaped by the Inquisition itself. Historians have long relied on the printed accounts and images the Inquisition produced, which often glorified the event and the Inquisition's role in it. These sources, however, might not tell the whole story. They were meant to show the Inquisition's power and authority, often depicting grand scenes with nobles, clergy, and royalty presiding over the humiliated and punished heretics. But is this the entire truth? In reality, public autos de fe were not as common as we might think. In the early 16th century, they were rare. After the Protestant Reformation in the mid-1500s, they became even less frequent, often happening only once in a person's lifetime. In many places, especially where there were fewer heretics to punish, the Inquisition couldn't afford the elaborate ceremonies. For example, in Barcelona, an inquisitor noted in 1560 that public autos were necessary to instill fear, but the tribunal was too poor to hold them regularly. By the early 1600s, public autos in Barcelona were almost non-existent, with the Inquisition opting for smaller, church-based ceremonies instead. The public auto de fe was a way for the Inquisition to assert its presence in the community. In Spain, the streets were the heart of social life, where people gathered for all sorts of events and celebrations. The Inquisition wanted to be a part of this, to show its power and influence. However, this wasn't always easy. Many people were indifferent to the Inquisition's ceremonies. They saw the auto de fe as a novelty, something different and colorful, rather than a reflection of their own religious beliefs. This indifference was not unique to the Inquisition. The Church faced similar challenges in getting people to take religious festivities seriously. For instance, the Bishop of Barcelona lamented in 1650 that people brought snacks and chairs into the church during Holy Week, showing a lack of reverence. The auto de fe evolved over time. In its early years, it was a simple religious rite with little public appeal. The first recorded auto in Barcelona in 1487 was a small, cold December morning affair with little fanfare. It wasn't until the mid-1500s that the Inquisition began to stage more elaborate public ceremonies. In 1559, Inquisitor General Valdes created new rules for a more dramatic and ceremonial auto de fe. The first of these new-style autos was held in Valladolid in the presence of King Philip II. The ceremony included a sermon, the king's oath to support the Inquisition, a procession of penitents, and a solemn mass. It lasted for about 12 hours and was designed to be both impressive and intimidating. Despite these efforts, the new-style autos didn't always go as planned. There were often conflicts over who should attend and in what order. For example, at the first new-style auto in Valladolid, the judges of the royal court refused to attend because they weren't given proper precedence. Over time, the Inquisition became more insistent on the presence of officials, but many still refused to participate. Even the king's presence was rare. Philip II attended only 3 autos in his lifetime, and his daughter, a Spanish princess, had never seen one by the age of 18. This shows that the auto de fe was not a central part of Spanish royal or religious life. In some regions like Catalonia, local authorities and even the king's own viceroy often boycotted the autos. The inquisitors of Barcelona noted that neither the viceroy nor the city councillors usually attended. When Philip II did attend an auto in Barcelona in 1564, it was more of a coincidence than a display of royal power. The inquisitors seized the opportunity to stage a grand ceremony, but it was an exception rather than the rule. The last great public auto de fe of the Habsburg dynasty was in 1680. A French ambassador who attended described it as more of a show of the inquisitors' desire for display than a genuine religious zeal. By this time, the Spanish monarchy was in decline, and the Inquisition was trying to maintain its image of power and authority. The grand painting of the 1680 auto by Rizzi was another attempt to project this image, but it was an exception, not the norm. In the end, the auto de fe was a carefully crafted ceremony designed to assert the Inquisition's presence and authority. While it could be a grand and intimidating event, it was not as central to Spanish life as we might think. The Inquisition's efforts to make it a part of the community's religious life often met with indifference or resistance, and its true impact on Spanish society was more limited than the grandiose images and accounts suggest. As we delve into the history of the Inquisition, we uncover a complex tapestry of public spectacle, religious fervor, and social dynamics. The auto da fe, or public ceremony, was a dramatic and often elaborate event that aimed to showcase the power and authority of the Inquisition. However, the reality of these events was often far less grand and more nuanced than the propaganda of the time would have us believe. During the later years of the Inquisition, when the incidence of heresy was declining, the public ceremonies became more elaborate, almost like a Baroque art form. These events were designed to be impressive, with the Inquisition taking great care to distribute information sheets after each auto to assert its achievements. One such event in Valladolid in 1559, coinciding with the return of the new king after a 5-year absence, attracted a significant crowd. But the question remains, were people really there to witness the Inquisition spectacle, or were they more interested in the presence of the king and the other dignitaries? Historians often describe these events as drawing massive crowds, with the streets filled with people dressed in their best clothes, singing and cheering. However, contemporary texts and illustrations offer little support for these grand claims. Instead, it seems that the main attraction for many was the presence of royalty and the festive atmosphere of the day, rather than the religious ceremony itself. The auto da fe reached its peak in the 1560s and 1570s, particularly in Castile, where it was used to suppress Protestantism. These events were often scheduled to coincide with holidays, making them part of the larger social and religious calendar. However, after the 1570s, public autos became increasingly rare. By the 1700s, they had all but disappeared, partly due to the lack of accused heretics and the high costs of staging such elaborate events. The Inquisition's own propaganda, as well as later fictional accounts, often exaggerated the impact and scale of these ceremonies. In literature and art, the auto da fe was portrayed as a grand and terrible spectacle of religious fervor and punishment. For example, in Voltaire's Candide, the auto da fe is satirically depicted as a futile attempt to prevent earthquakes by burning people at the stake. Similarly, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor is shown burning scores of victims in a single day. In reality, the public auto da fe was a relatively short-lived phenomenon, lasting only about a decade. It was more of a marginal event in the religious and cultural life of Spain, often attended more for the festive atmosphere and the presence of important figures than for the religious ceremony itself. By the 1700s, the new Bourbon kings, like Philip V, began to distance themselves from these events, and by the mid-18th century, only private autos were being held. Beyond the public spectacles, The Inquisition also provided a unique window into the lives of women in early modern Spain. The detailed records of the tribunal offer insights into the roles and experiences of women, who were often more active and influential in their communities than previously thought. While the structure of power was generally dominated by men, women played crucial roles in family life, agriculture, and local economies. In rural areas, women often managed households and farms, especially in the absence of their husbands, who might be away working or fishing. The Inquisition's records show that women were not unfairly targeted, and were involved in a wide range of cases, from accusations of heresy to witchcraft. Despite the prevailing attitudes of the time, which often portrayed women in a negative light, many women found ways to assert their independence and authority within their communities. The inquisitors, while all male, did not consistently treat women with bias, and the records reflect a more complex and varied picture of gender relations. In the end, the auto da fe and the Inquisition itself were products of their time, shaped by religious, social, and political forces. While they left a lasting mark on history, their true impact and nature are often misunderstood. By examining the evidence more closely, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of these events and the people who lived through them. The legacy of the Inquisition is a reminder of the complexities of human history and the importance of critical thinking in interpreting the past.